5 months before he rode on screen in spotless white as Buster Scruggs, Tim Blake Nelson's own teenage son was teaching him how to change guitar chords without letting the strain show on his face. He still couldn't spin a revolver reliably. He still couldn't guide a horse with his legs while singing at the same time. "I'm not a great writer," he admitted once, an odd confession from a man about to become one of the screen's most convincing cowboys. It worked so well that people assumed it came naturally to him. 3 years later, a second cowboy movie released into barely 30 theaters would make that assumption impossible to keep believing. But to understand why that second film hit as hard as it did, you have to go all the way back to where a Brown University classics scholar first decided he'd rather play the fool than the hero. Tim Blake Nelson was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1964 to a social activist mother and a geologist father in a Jewish family whose grandparents had fled Nazi Germany before the war. He studied classics at Brown under philosopher Martha Nussbaum, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, stood as his class's senior orator, then walked straight into Juilliard's brutal acting program instead of law school or academia, graduating in 1990 with no plan except to disappear into whatever roles the industry would actually hand him. His first film, a college-shot oddity called The Refrigerator, was about, in his own bewildered words, a refrigerator that ate people. He didn't fully understand the plot going in. He just showed up the same instinct that would define nearly every choice he made for the next 30 years. That same instinct pushed him into improvised street theater around 1991. Two guys in polyester suits on a rectangle of AstroTurf inventing absurd historical lies about knowing philosophers and chancellors a century earlier. The kind of aggressively silly material nobody would ever guess came from a classics graduate until a producer named Debbie Liebling, who later helped build South Park, dropped her card in their bucket and put him on MTV, a gig Nelson isn't even sure was legally binding, joking that they probably never signed a single contract for it. It led directly to Nora Ephron casting him in 1992's This Is My Life after one sit-down meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel, telling him he'd play a babysitter moonlighting as a stand-up comic and that the two of them should figure out his act together. Nelson, only 2 years out of drama school, went home to New York, wrote an entire set of jokes himself, and walked the pages straight to Ephron's apartment unasked, something he's since admitted he probably shouldn't have done, since she'd likely intended to workshop the material with him in the room instead. She read them anyway, looked up, startled, and told him she hadn't been expecting that, but they could work with it. He said the trick was remembering his character was a bitter, failed comic, meaning he didn't need to write jokes that were actually funny, only jokes that failed on purpose, which he's called a lot easier to pull off. 3 years later, Ben Stiller offered him a small role in Heavyweights, the same instant he read for it in the room, no audition needed, landed through a Juilliard classmate's connection to Stiller and to the film's writer, Steve Brill. A level of instant trust that still surprises Nelson when he thinks back on it now. Nelson jumped at the chance, despite privately worrying he was too young for the part, and found himself hanging around the set with a young Judd Apatow in what amounted to barely more than a cameo one scene involving a video appearance alongside Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira. It's a blink of a role in the finished film, but he said he still gets stopped on the street for it constantly, calling it genuinely astonishing given how little screen time he actually has. A pattern of directors simply deciding about him on sight that would define the next 3 decades. The real test came in 1998 on Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, a director Nelson had idolized as a hero of American cinema. So much so that simply getting the call that Malick wanted him to read the new script felt, in his own words, like proof his years in drama school had actually been worth something. What he found once filming began upended nearly everything he thought he understood about how movies got made. Malick would frequently strip actors of their own lines the night before or the morning of a shoot, improvising entire scenes on the spot, less interested in the script as written than in stripping away the given circumstances of his own narrative until the story felt more immediate and alive. It was brutal on the actors, Nelson included, and he's called the entire experience nothing short of humbling. And in a line, he still repeats, exactly like film school. The moment he understood a movie belongs to its director, and an actor's only job is to serve it completely, however much ground gets pulled out from under him along the way. 2 years later, that total surrender to trust paid off in the biggest way of his career. Joel Coen, a close friend by then, called him out of nowhere, asking for his address, said he wanted advice, and Nelson assumed it was about the Odyssey since he'd heard Clooney had signed on to a new Coen film loosely built on Homer. A week after the script arrived, Joel called back with the real offer. "Move your own film, edit down to Mississippi, because we want you to play Delmar." There had never been an audition. Nelson had a newborn at home and a contractual deadline to deliver his own film to Harvey Weinstein in 6 weeks instead of 10. So he worked brutal days in the edit bay and memorized Coen Brothers dialogue every night, trusting a director who'd offered him a lead role without ever hearing him read a single line, the same instinct that had already transformed the careers of character actors like John Turturro and Frances McDormand herself. On set, he found out why he specifically had been chosen. The film's now famous 3-shot what Ethan called 3 dopes walking across Mississippi only gave close-ups to Clooney's Ulysses. And Joel told the crew flatly that Tim wouldn't have a problem with that arrangement. He didn't. He and Clooney played wiffle ball together nearly every day between setups. And the toad-chasing scene fans still bring up constantly was entirely real, no digital effects at all. An actual amphibian that genuinely escaped into the water while Nelson splashed after it, anxious the whole time that the moment needed real emotional truth underneath the slapstick, or none of the comedy would land. He begged Joel for the chance to sing "In the Jailhouse Now" himself, a gamble that paid off when the soundtrack unexpectedly won a Grammy for Album of the Year, one he still calls one of the most undeserved awards he's ever received. In 2002, Steven Spielberg called him personally about a part in Minority Report without offering a script to read first. Nelson, terrified less of turning the part down than of showing up unprepared, asked politely but firmly if he could see the pages before agreeing. Spielberg said, "Of course," sent over what turned out to be mostly a set of dense monologues, and Nelson arrived on set having them fully memorized, only to watch Spielberg grow visibly unsatisfied during their first attempt at the scene. Spielberg finally asked, almost offhandedly, whether Nelson could do a Boston accent. Nelson, who'd gone to college in nearby Rhode Island, said he could, and the two of them built the entire character, live right there on set. Spielberg reshaping the character's voice and rhythm around that single accent, the way a painter might shift an entire canvas around one new color he'd just discovered. A year later, in 2003, that same willingness to look foolish on purpose landed him one of his most beloved roles yet, playing the sweaty camp counselor in Holes. "I loved being in Holes," he said, and he gets stopped on the street for it more than almost anything else he's ever done. Getting hit across the face with a shovel by young actor Cleo Thomas, whom he still keeps in touch with, remains one of his favorite scenes to talk about exactly the kind of undignified comedy he's chased his whole career. Because, as he's put it, he'd rather be the guy standing next to the guy than be the guy himself, since that's usually where the best material lives. By 2008, that same reputation for embracing exactly the roles other actors avoided pulled him into blockbuster territory almost by accident. He was called into a hotel lobby meeting, expecting to discuss a single film, The Incredible Hulk, and walked out having signed on for 3, playing a wildly eccentric scientist who eventually becomes a villain called the Leader, only to discover the role of Bruce Banner itself was still being decided between Mark Ruffalo and his own close friend and future directing collaborator, Edward Norton. A casting question Nelson has said genuinely surprised him given how obviously right Norton seemed for the part, even before the studio had confirmed it. Norton got the part, and the two actors ended up on screen together after all, right before shooting Nelson's own passion project, Leaves of Grass, together immediately afterward. 4 years later, in 2012, Spielberg called again, this time for Lincoln. And Nelson said yes without even reading the script, unwilling to hassle a director he respected that much a second time, trusting entirely that if Spielberg wanted him for it, there had to be a reason worth showing up for. What he found on set was a level of period discipline he'd never encountered anywhere else. Daniel Day. Lewis staying fully in character at all times. Spielberg banning modern anachronisms from the set entirely, right down to Nelson, an espresso drinker needing a period-appropriate cup just to have his coffee between takes. He's told the story of veteran actor Hal Holbrook innocently greeting Day-Lewis by his real name on his very first day, prompting Spielberg to rush over and very carefully explain that this was in fact the President of the United States they were speaking to, only for Holbrook to nod solemnly and immediately tell Day-Lewis how great he'd been in that wheelchair movie. Anyway, then in 2018, a promise the Coens had made almost 20 years earlier finally came due. After hearing him sing on the O Brothers soundtrack, Joel and Ethan had floated half as a joke that Nelson should eventually play a singing gunslinger funny, specifically because he looks nothing like anyone's idea of a cowboy. 15 years passed before Joel finally walked the finished Buster Scruggs script over to his apartment, since the two men happened to be neighbors by then, warning him it would still take years to write the rest of what would become an anthology film. It did. 3 more years passed before financing finally came through. By the time cameras rolled, roughly 18 years after the original idea, Nelson had 6 months to learn guitar from his own son, master a full set of pistol tricks, and record 4 songs, all while privately admitting he wasn't actually much of a horseman. Nelson has described the whole Coen Brothers dynamic as something close to a contradiction, unbelievably controlling and meticulous, and yet somehow no actor ever feels more free to try anything, take any risk without fear of failing. He's called it without hesitation the most fun he's ever had on any set in his entire career. And the performance became so effortlessly charming that critics and audiences alike simply assumed this must be who Blake Nelson naturally was, a cheerful-born gunslinger, rather than a man who'd spent half a year desperately practicing to fake it. A year later, Damon Lindelof's Watchmen introduced him to a completely new audience who'd never seen a Coen Brothers film in their lives. He's described the show as being fundamentally about vigilantism and the corrosive psychology of revenge rather than conventional superheroics, giving him a character built on real fragility and despair underneath a superhero premise that barely felt like one alongside Regina King, whom he's called one of the classiest people he's ever worked with, and Jeremy Irons and Don Johnson rounding out a cast he's spoken about with more genuine enthusiasm than almost any comic book adaptation usually earns. But it was 2021's Old Henry that finally proved just how much work had actually been hiding behind that easy Buster Scruggs charm. Director Patsy Panzaroli didn't even think Nelson was, in his own words, a reasonable get, and only offered him the role over email while Nelson was standing in his kitchen heating up food. His reaction, reading it, was somewhere between disbelief and dark comedy. Well, it happened, he thought. You've been offered a character described as old. But the real gut punch came deeper into the script when Nelson realized the same way an audience does watching the finished film that his character, a quiet, widowed farmer hiding his violent past from his own son, was secretly Billy the Kid. That revelation nearly talked him out of the part entirely. I'm not a violent person, and I'm generally a forgiving person, he admitted. I don't own any guns. The distance between that character and me is quite long. I didn't want to show up on Patsy's set and disappoint him. He spent 6 months alone just working out how the character should sound and move, another 6 months shaping the 100-page script alongside Panzaroli, and 2 more months physically rebuilding his body to handle a gun, sit a horse, and move like a man who'd spent a lifetime trying to forget how good he once was at killing. His own pistol training for Buster Scruggs turned out to be the only thing that made it possible at all. Though he said the two characters approached the exact same revolver like completely different men, Buster Scruggs treated the gun as a performance, an extension of showmanship. Henry saw it as a laconically lethal tool he wanted to minimize using entirely. One he throws away the instant it's done. Its job. A detail Nelson and Panzaroli deliberately built into the character together. Asked half-jokingly who would actually win a shootout between his two cowboys, Nelson didn't hesitate. Old Henry, he said, because Buster Scruggs would be too busy showing off. The film premiered at the Venice Film Festival in September 2021, released into barely 30 theaters in the United States, and still walked away with a startling 95% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes critics, calling it the performance of Nelson's career and pushing his name seriously into that year's awards conversation for the first time in decades. His own son, Gavin Lewis, played his character's son on screen, turning a film about a father hiding an extraordinary past from his child into something that quietly mirrored Nelson's own life in ways almost nobody watching it could have known. And there finally was, proof the industry had been getting it backwards the whole time. Buster Scruggs hadn't been effortless. It had been 5 brutal months of practice disguised as charm. Old Henry simply forced everyone to notice the difference between an actor who looks natural and a man who has never once stopped working to make it look that way. So, what really happened to Tim Blake Nelson? Nothing tragic, nothing hidden behind some big reveal. A Phi Beta Kappa classic scholar who studied under one of the great philosophical minds of his generation, who trained at Juilliard and quietly wrote plays about the Holocaust, including The Gray Zone, a drama about the Auschwitz Sonderkommando that almost none of his comedic fans have any idea even exists, spent 3 decades deliberately vanishing into doofuses, hicks, and reformed outlaws because that's where he's always found the richest, strangest, most human material to play every single time. From a refrigerator movie he didn't understand, to a Coen Brothers lead he had no business getting, to a Billy the Kid he swore he wasn't suited to play the pattern repeats itself. He doubts himself first, he worries about disappointing the person who believed in him, and then he outworks that doubt completely, quietly, for months, until the finished performance looks like it cost him nothing at all. Asked once what kind of roles he actually plays after mentioning his own Juilliard training, his answer was 2 words. Doofuses, mostly. It's the funniest line in every interview clip precisely because it's true and precisely because it's the exact opposite of the truth underneath it. If this look behind the many faces of Tim Blake Nelson moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are decades more hiding behind that easy Oklahoma draw than most people ever stop to notice. And we'll keep pulling back the curtain on the actors quietly stealing every scene they're in, one underrated performance at a time.